Good evening. Good evening. Or like I like to say, what's up? Thank you, Abby. Thank you to all of you who have rallied to help make this talk possible. I'm really glad to be here. I want to give a couple of shout outs to my people. Everywhere I go, I have a crew that's, Black Girl Survival Strategy. So Dr. Lanice Avery and Dr. Tamika Carey are my crew. Those are my people, so y'all take care of them. The title I gave you guys was Eloquent Rage in 2019. I'm going to have some more focused remarks than that. These remarks are titled Beyond Diversity and Inclusion, the Character and Content of the University. So I want to begin this day, one day, after we acknowledge the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., by acknowledging that we are a nation at war with ourselves. This is the 32nd day that our government has been shut down because the man who occupies the highest office in this land thinks he can wall out the enemy, when the truth is that the enemy already lives within our borders. For Trump and those Americans who continue to doggedly support him are the enemies of progress, of democracy, and of truth. This may be a difficult way to begin this speech, but Dr. King was not a prophet of feel-good politics. It would be disrespectful to him and to the memory of Heather Heyer to stand here in this city and tell anything other than the truth. Dr. King asked us to be courageous, to tell hard truths, to take this nation to task for the ways it insists on beating and battering people of color and the poor. That is our task here this evening. Our task is not to make ourselves feel good with the whitewashed, palatable versions of King that have floated down to us in the nearly 51 years since he was assassinated on a Memphis hotel balcony. When I think about what Dr. King would say of this moment of Trump, this moment of pervasive, perfunctory, perverse terror enacted on those of us who are Black and woman and trans, and today the Supreme Court affirmed that Donald Trump's ban of trans people in the military can go forward, and queer and working class and immigrant and indigenous and Latinx by the political right, and this moment of profound moral cowardice on the part of the political left, I believe he would implore me and others to tell the truth, to break the silence, to make others uncomfortable, even as I am uncomfortable with my own daily complicity with empire. These are not pretty times. These are not times where we can distort Dr. King's message and reduce his offering to us to one line from his 1963 March on Washington address, in which he hoped that one day his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We have seen too many white people pervert this message, arguing that King imagined a colorblind world, and that to insist that race still matters is to unfairly judge white people and to look past the content of their character in favor of assuming things about the color of their skin. The irony of this is, of course, that Trump is president of these United States because of the color of his skin and because of his gender, and certainly not because of the content of his character. Now, you cannot lock up children in cages and be a person of good character. You cannot deprive public servants of pay and drive them into a crisis of desperation over food and shelter and a game of political one-upsmanship and be a person of good character. You cannot lie more than you tell the truth and be a person of good character. If character trumped color as the marker of leadership in this country, it goes without saying that Trump would not be the president of these United States. But then also, we could also say that perhaps content is precisely the reason. The content of his character is precisely the reason that he is the president of these United States. It is complicated. But it's easy to criticize your president, y'all's president. He makes it easy. What is harder is undoing the colonizing impulses that show up every day in the environs of the university. What is harder is disrupting the narratives we have that we are bastions of liberalism on our campuses. In the environs of the university, we play out the conversation of content versus character in an endless conversation that pits merit against diversity. We have a whole generation of white students who are resentful of students of color because they have been told that these students are taking seats on college campuses away from them because of diversity. These students believe that students of color are getting a leg up because of skin color rather than because of merit. Yet, when we look out at the campuses we are on, they are overwhelmingly white. The leadership is overwhelmingly white. And a diversity narrative goes forth that suggests that to change the makeup of the university is to fundamentally change its character by reducing the meritorious structure that undergirds it. We are told that the content of programs like gender studies and ethnic studies challenge the character of the university in ways that need to be contained. But what if we acknowledge that the structure which undergirds the university has always placed whiteness atop merit? How can merit be a structuring feature of any of our institutions when the presence of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy work by making anyone who is not white, male, and middle class, and cisgender, and straight, and able-bodied have to work extra hard to get to the starting line of the race? We're not even talking about the finish line, just to the starting line. So if you ask me what our task is here today, I want to say clearly that the we I'm talking to are people in and of the university. We are in a dangerous era of post-truth and post-facts where our students and fellow citizens struggle to disentangle bad information and alternative facts from good, credible information. The university and the work we do here should be at the forefront of holding aloft the banner of truth or truths and helping the nation to make its way through the rhetorical perfidy of this moment. But we can't do that if we won't tell our own hard truths about the often colonial project of the university. In the spirit of Dr. King, who said in his famous 1967 sermon, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence, that, quote, "The calling to speak is a vocation of agony, but we must speak." And in the spirit of Audre Lorde, who said, quote, "For it is not the difference which immobilizes us, but silence, I offer these words." In 2016, I had the pleasure of giving a TED Talk about new work I'm doing on race and the politics of time. Now look, I'm trying to take a mental break because I've been writing too many damn books. But when I get back to writing book-length projects, I'm gonna try to work out this thing about race and temporality, in addition to many other wonderful scholars who are doing that work as well. But in the TED Talk, I floated the idea that many of the schisms that shape issues of race and diversity might be understood as a battle between those perceived to be world makers and those perceived to be space takers. And it draws in the talk on these ideas that come from Western philosophers like George Hegel and Immanuel Kant, who cast African people as people without a history and as people who had made no significant contribution to the civilized world. Because these people were not considered world makers, it was perfectly justifiable to colonize their lands and steal their bodies. Black people and indigenous people were considered space takers who kept European colonizers from doing the apparently necessary work of bringing what they called civilization to the rest of the world. These logics about space taking and world making continue to persist in the microcosms of our daily lives. Universities, for instance, are key sites for the inculcation of world making. We fight for students to have access to the university precisely because, as we tell them, the ideas they learn there can change the world for the better. We tell them that the people who make the most impact on history must first go to college. If you're first generation, you know that isn't true, right? World making is an intrinsic part of what Professor Tressie Cottom calls the gospel of higher education. Yet much of the public conversation and bellyaching on the right about higher education has been about Black students as space takers who keep white students from slots that they rightfully deserve. And we are also doing this to immigrant communities, saying that they are taking up space from Americans and preventing Americans from engaging in their project of colonial-ass world making. When Black students enter the university, they often enter as students who are trying to overcome cultural perceptions of themselves as space takers by getting the kind of education that will elevate them to the status of being world makers. Yet what often happens is that those in positions of power use the slow pace and excuse of bureaucracy and not alienating rich conservative donors and protecting the academic freedom of the old white guys who still dominate the professoriate as a reason not to make the radical shifts necessary for the true work of diversity and inclusion to occur. So how then do we create a culture of inclusion on campus that honors the diversity of experiences, gives students room to grow and evolve, and does this not at the expense of Black students, undocumented students, queer students, or faculty of color? How do we have the kinds of transformative campus conversations both inside and outside of the classroom that help us to quell violence rather than foment it? One of the core questions that guides my politics and intellectual investments as a scholar activists is, do Black Lives Matter to the university? I understand quite clearly in this moment of antagonism against immigrant communities, first-generation Americans, and the never-ending antagonism towards indigenous peoples, that diversity is not just about Black people. However, these conversations about diversity and inclusion on university campuses have largely been the result of multiple generations of Black students storming the gates, putting their bodies and futures on the line to expose the structural operations of white supremacy in university spaces and demanding a different set of outcomes. Diversity and inclusion have in fact become anodyne restagings for what was half a century ago a much more difficult conversation about the stakes and costs of racial integration. Having failed at that project in meaningful ways at both the K-12 level and the collegiate level, watered down conversations about diversity and inclusion have become the order of the day. So, in order to make clear what a path forward may look like, I want to return us to what is apparently an old idea. It's 30 years old this year, which is actually not old. Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, which some of you think is all the rage and others of you think you are beyond. But let us see. Let us hypo-test. Intersectionality has become one of the defining theoretical interventions not only of Black feminism, with which it is most readily associated, but with critical race theory, which is the legal intellectual tradition out of which the term emerges. Intersectionality is one of the most misused words in campus conversations about race and diversity today. A whole generation of students thinks that the primary goal of being intersectional is being able to articulate the contours of one's race, gender, class, and sexual identity. Such approaches make for interesting feel-good workshops on diversity and shifting personal attitudes, but it does not ever lead to substantive shifts at the structural level. In this way, intersectionality has been used as a way to make the political infinitely personal. However, Crenshaw's articulation of intersectionality was less concerned with the navel-gazing identity politics of one's particular race, class, and gender. Her concept was meant to point us to structures of power, systems of white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, and the ways these systems conspired to make the concerns and injuries sustained by vulnerable groups invisible to the very powers who had the ability to enact some form of repair. In other words, the mantra of intersectionality was not about race and gender and class, but rather about racism and sexism and capitalism. If intersectionality is simply a conversation about one's race, gender, and class position, then its mandates towards justice, repair, and real integration become easily co-opted into the innocuous language of diversity and inclusion. If intersectionality is only about each of our unique mixes of personal identity, then it becomes easily co-optable in the neoliberal university. I know neoliberalism is also a buzzword that gets tossed around these days, and a lot of you don't know what it means, and too many of you think you know what it means, and everybody use it wrong. But we would do well to attend to it. You know, I'm probably just saying, like, that academic thing that we do, like, be for real, right, for a moment. Right? Part of what neoliberalism looks like in universities is that they are endlessly concerned with training students for the workforce rather than equipping them to deal with real issues. And to the undergrads in this room, I would say to you that if college has not made you go home at night and be like, everything I thought was true is a goddamn lie, you have not been to college. I would submit that if a university is not committed to funding and sustaining programs in the humanities, in English and history, for instance, but also in women's and gender studies, Black or Africana studies, or Latinx studies, then it is not committed to the work of diversity and inclusion. Part of what I am suggesting is that the work of diversity and inclusion is difficult because those who are called to do this work are being asked not to fully transform the spaces in which we work, but rather to simply make them look more colorful and appropriate to the powers that be. Lest I be accused of minimizing the work of diversity administrators who are often in a difficult position, I want to be clear that moving from diversity and inclusion to intersectionality involves a clear analysis of power and then a ceding of power. For instance, one of the classic moves of universities is to bring in people of color, and in my experience, Black women, to do the heavy lifting of diversity initiatives. I want to shout out Black women because typically we bring an ethos that is about justice and equitable distribution of resources to these positions. Now, you know, for my POMO, post-structuralist folks in the room, I recognize the danger of essentialism in my remarks. But all of you who have had to navigate predominantly white institutions and predominantly Black ones too, know precisely the sisters that I speak of, because those are the ones that make sure you get paid, make sure your courses get entered, make sure you can get the rooms that y'all know what I'm talking about. And if they ain't sisters, they Latinx, they sisters, Black or brown. I want to shout out these Black women and women of color because they are by and large the people who do the invisible labor of making the diversity project of institutions work. Despite incredible levels of success in recruiting students of color, these women's leadership is undermined. They are often unceremoniously removed from decision-making positions, particularly when they start to be effective, and when institutional priorities around diversity change. And their labor and ideas are frequently co-opted by liberal white people who have all the right rhetoric, but who have not done the work to dismantle the white supremacy within. And look, that's what we need liberal white people to do. We don't need you to tell us how cool you are because you're not racist like your grandmama was. We actually need you to sit and think about what it means that if you see a person of color in a leadership role, can you actually deal? Because that's the true test of whether you really dismantled it. Can you follow the lead of someone else? This is the reason why you had so many President Obama voters and then who turned to Trump voters, right? Because they thought they could follow the lead of a Black man, but seeing him there every day just kind of like fucked with people's sense of security. Because there's nothing more that's more of a sense of security than white supremacy. And seeing that dismantled visually was not something that white people could handle. Even folks who were liberal enough to vote for the man in 1 or 2 elections. I want all of the people in this room to think about whether you are these people, the people of color who make the diversity project of the institution work, or I want you to think about whether if you are not these people, your labor is made easier by these people. Then ask yourselves whether if you are in a position of power, you have provided the institutional resources and advocacy to help the folks who do the diversity work of the institution to do their jobs. I am pointing to the intellectual and institutional labor of Black women because far too often, Black women are asked to do the heavy lifting to hold not just the university together, but the country together, while being treated as mere devoted laborers rather than thinkers and intellectuals and strategists who say, we know this is a sinking ship, but we're gonna try to help everybody live as much as we can for as long as we can before the thing busts or goes down. In 2017, I was able to publish my first book, Beyond Respectability, about the long history of Black women's intellectual production. That book was my critical homage to the Black feminist intellectuals who helped me to claim a feminism for myself. These women, Anna Julia Cooper, Fannie Barrier Williams, Mary Church Terrell, Pauli Murray, Toni Cade Bambara, and others, helped me make sense of my own journey as a first-generation Southern working-class overachieving Black girl. In that book, I sought to join a tradition of Black feminist scholars who had insisted that Black women's intellectual production and our theorizing mattered. I wrote that book because all too often I found myself in graduate school classrooms where folks thought that the only people who had a theoretical orientation to the world were white men. Though I finished my schooling nearly a decade ago, this fetishizing of white men's intellectual production as the most critical parts of what we need to know persists. My own journey has been about affirming all of the ways Black women know. I wrote the first book as a way to chronicle the journeys of early Black women intellectuals who did their work primarily in communities because they cared about the work of getting free. One of the reasons that we continue to know so little about women like Mary Church Terrell and Fannie Barrier Williams as thinkers is not because they weren't prolific both in their written work and in their community activism and institution building, but because they didn't have the benefit of an institutional force and a steady paycheck to drive their knowledge production. I am reminded in this moment of Anna Arnold Hedgeman, the only woman to work on the formal planning committee for the 1963 March on Washington, who I also write about in Beyond Respectability. In her memoir, as she recalled hearing Dr. King's speech, she said that she very much wished that he had said not, I have a dream, but we have a dream. For King's dream was not his alone. but was a collective project of Black people, including Black women across multiple centuries demanding freedom. We can both revere Dr. King and tell him that we mad at the way he didn't represent for sisters. Eloquent rage is capacious enough to allow for this kind of complexity and messiness in the analysis, so that we don't continue to revere brothers when they both represent for the race but manage to forget that Black men aren't the only people that this freedom project is about. It's the messiness that messes us up. It's messiness, and it's what I like to call performative wokeness. Let me explain. One of the questions that those engaged in diversity and inclusion work on university campuses must ask is the question about safe space. Is the campus a safe space for students of color? Are classrooms safe spaces for students of color? What I want to say about this is that I have a range of conflicting feelings on the matter. And when my feelings are in conflict, I try to center a politics of justice as a compass for the future that I would like to arrive at. So what do I mean? Well, let us say unequivocally that campuses are not safe spaces for Black students, queer and trans students, or students with disabilities. Where my feelings are in conflict is that as a Black girl educated in predominantly white institutions, save my 4 years at Howard University, I never had the expectation that these spaces would be safe. Sometimes I'm not sure how to respond to students who demand safety. But I can't tell if that's like a reasonable response to them or PTSD talking, right? Sometimes those demands mistake discomfort, particularly when one is confronted with forms of privilege, for lack of safety. I'm also concerned with safety discourses because they don't give students the room to shift and grow. As an instructor in courses that center the study of gender and race and sexuality, I always want my students to own their problematic and uncritical ideas about Blackness, queerness, transness, and a host of other marginalized identities. We cannot shift the thinking that we will not admit to. But now we live in a moment where classroom spaces are not places to work out ideas because students armed with the language of social justice are quick to engage in policing and silencing behaviors when their classmates don't perform their wokeness with precision. I don't find this set of attitudes or this performative wokeness or radicalism to be especially helpful either. We are in a, that's what white kids often struggle with in the classroom. But we are in a moment where we care so much about being right, being intersectional, and saying the right things that sometimes we don't move or act or theorize with the good sense Big Mama bequeathed us. That's what Black kids struggle with in the classroom. Because you get so woke that you roll around the university and say, this shit don't matter. It's all elitist. It's all terrible. I don't know what we doing here. And then I'm always, as somebody who was working class and who started out my life in the projects and watched my mama work every day to make ends meet, I always think that it's so deeply disrespectful when I see Black folks who get to the university and get so radical and say that nothing we do here is unique. Because I'm like, but I lived on the block. And so if people on the block knew what it took to get free, most of our people live or one generation removed from the block. Why we ain't free yet? So what lie are you telling? And who are you telling it for? And if you think that there's nothing worth getting in a place like this, then why did your grandmama work so hard and press $20 into your hand every time you came home for you to go somewhere that wasn't worth anything? And so who are you lying to when you tell them that nothing that we do here is radical or worthy? That's also performative wokeness. Intersectionality becomes performative wokeness when all your rhetoric sounds great, but your interpersonal engagement with others is trash. If you talk crazy to the people who raised you, you treat the homegirls who mean something to you terribly, and you mistreat the folks in the trenches with you, then you're not revolutionary, you're raggedy. You're engaged in performative wokeness if you've built a whole identity in these places based on being the only one. And Black folks struggle with that because Black exceptionalism is seductive. We like being the only one. Get threatened when you find out that Black girl magic abounds, right? You're engaged in performative wokeness if you're doing it to be seen and get cookies and affirmation from marginalized groups. White people, that's performative wokeness. We don't need to know that you're really not one of the bad ones. We need you to go get the bad ones and make them better. Far too often, diversity work begins from the question of asking how white students can have a diverse experience. Even the language of inclusion itself reinscribes the idea that the primary goal of diversity efforts is simply to include those who were previously excluded. A critical shift occurs when we begin to ask questions about whether students of color deserve safe spaces on campus, even as we concede that campuses can never be fully safe or inoculated from the rest of the world. Often these conversations about protecting safe spaces for students of color are foreclosed as impediments to the free speech of white students or conservative students. But there are two things to say about this. First, it is absolutely absurd to think that professors like myself who teach unpopular material about white supremacy and racism would want to curtail freedom of speech or academic freedom at any level, because how would I be standing before you tonight telling white people they need to do better without academic freedom? Second, however, we should ask whether students of color should have the academic freedom to learn in environments that are not racially antagonistic or anti-Black. Teaching against white supremacy does not constitute racial hostility or antagonism to white students. We already know that ensuring the comfort of white students is typically a priority of university administrations. We should begin to insist that ensuring the safety of students of color also becomes an institutional priority. Having been an instructor of college students for more than a decade, I continue to be amazed at the persisting nature of narratives of racial antagonism that my students tell me during class and during office hours. Making space to hear student stories about professors who don't believe they wrote the papers that they submitted, or professors who refuse to place any Black people on the syllabus in literature, history, or theory courses, or professors who refuse to check students who make problematic statements, is part of the invisible work of diversity that faculty of color do without time off, extra pay, or extended tenure clocks. This is the invisible and thankless labor of diversity that professors and educators of color do, and staff of color do, and students of color know it. They know that having more Black professors, for instance, means that they potentially have more advocates. Universities know this too. Yet there has been no attempt at any structural level to support faculty members who do the critical emotional labor of retention. You bring in Black students, you don't take care of them, you put the labor on your Black faculty members to keep them here, and then you don't want to give folks time off, course releases, a nap room, something. It is customary for women of color graduate students to sit in my office and cry about the imposter syndrome and feelings of inadequacy that they are experiencing. When I teach graduate seminars, I have had to reframe how I teach them. They have to be really different than how I was taught. I teach graduate seminars in a way that makes space to do the extra hours of emotional counsel that go along with the job. And half the time what I'm doing in grad school is being like, these white boys that we read don't know nothing. You just have to know them so that you can say the shit that you want to say. But you're smart enough, you're good enough, you'll make it. That's for all the graduate students in the room. That's what I would say if you were taking my seminar, right? I see it as part and parcel of the teaching. My white colleagues don't have to make those negotiations, not usually. Acknowledging the labor that faculty members do for the work of diversity is just one more area that should shape university policies and faculty hiring and retention packages going forward. Some scholars and thinkers have come to understand endless calls to consider issues of diversity, intersectionality, and privilege as identity politics run amok. And we're moving into a new election cycle where we said that the last election cycle was about how identity politics had gotten out of hand and we beef with each other about it. But surely we are all clear about this point that there is no escaping identity politics. There is only before us the choice to be more or less just in our dealings. This is why I've chosen to return us again to the question of intersectionality rather than the contemporary language of diversity and inclusion. Intersectionality is fundamentally a project centered on procuring justice for those whose struggles are invisible to existing systems of power. Justice looks like using institutional power, privilege, and access to help the most marginalized. I also use the language of co-conspirator rather than ally intentionally. It is language that I have learned as part of my work for and participation in the movement for Black Lives. If we're co-conspirators, then that means we have all risked something and we all have something to lose if shit goes awry. The language of allyship is limited because people are out here declaring themselves allies to the struggle without remembering that being an ally is always a process, never a destination or a place of arrival. For instance, I would like to be, as a cisgender person, an ally to trans people, but I can only do that if I'm in community with trans people, if I'm accountable to trans people, if I'm willing to change. And more so than wanting the cookie of calling myself an ally, what it means to be a co-conspirator is that I have to ask what I am willing to risk in order for trans people to flourish, right? The choice here is between co-conspiratorship in the name of justice or complicity and participation in forms of what Dr. King called brutal solidarity. And in brutal solidarity, he was talking about black men and white men getting to fight together in Vietnam. But brutal solidarity means that if you're willing to engage in the work of oppression, then anybody can be accepted, no matter their race or class or gender. And that's not the kind of solidarity we need. The university is experiencing a great moment of reckoning. As more and more people on the right claim that colleges, because they are bastions of liberalism, are not necessary for their children. Those on the right who believe such things are being led by a politics of insularity and a fear of a fast approaching future in which white people are in the minority. They hope that by avoiding university spaces, they can stop the march of history. University administrators are under decreasing public funding and continue to court many of these conservative donors because they have money and power. It's an interesting conundrum, but I would charge all those in this room who have power not to keep making, if you have been, the fundamental miscalculation that so many on the right keep making. That is, being led by fear of the future rather than being excited about its possibilities. If black women's voting behavior can tell us anything, it is that black people and people of color are people of the future. We move in ways that sustain institutions without ravaging communities. That is a political stance that black women have perfected, and it provides a great building ground, necessary building ground, for the more radical futures to which we are all turning our attention. Black feminism taught me this. It's why I argue over and over again that the intersectional truths black women have taught us in their work, in their organizing, and in their institutional leadership can save our lives. There is nothing like the power of a bunch of black girls moving together on purpose for the project of freedom. And it's necessary to say this too. Black feminism is not a reactionary project. That's important because in this age of Twitter feminism, people think that all black girls are good for is clapping back. And look, the clap back is epic. And I feel like I can do it with the best of them. But sometimes people make me tired and I'm not interested, right? Because our clapbacks are epic and they are the model of what we mean, or what I mean when I say eloquent rage. But the problem is that sometimes people aren't worth your rage, because that's energy that you're giving people who don't know what to do with it. Rage is a kind of energy that, yeah, you can destroy some shit, but you can also build some things. And so that's why I talk about rage, but I also write about black women institution builders. We're building it because we're saying our people deserve better than this. We're mad at these conditions, so therefore we build the thing we want to see. So when I say black feminism is not a reactionary project, what I am saying is black feminism is not about calling out white women for racism and black men for sexism. That's not our primary set of goals. Not only anyway, I mean, it's one of the pleasures of the job. It's one of the requirements. I mean, R. Kelly being dropped from his label is just, a perk of eloquent rage. Woo, yes, clap it up for that. And that doesn't even mean that white women don't need to be called out. And I do a bit of calling out in eloquent rage. And what I want to say to white girls very briefly is that what I need y'all to do is, one, when you get called out, do not cry. If you must cry, go to a room of your own, a la Virginia Woolf, and do that. Because Virginia Woolf wasn't the first person to say that either, right? That's fine. Read Beverly Gottschalk's Words of Fire and you'll know what I mean. Stop crying and weaponizing your tears against us. And if you see other white girls crying, tell them to stop crying too. Get them some Kleenex and deal with them, which is the second point, which I say in Eloquent Rage. Go get your people. That is what I need y'all to do. We're about to have an election. I see people gearing up on Facebook to show out with each other about it and what's going to happen on the left. And all I need white women to do, whoever you vote for on the left, I need y'all to go out to the suburbs or wherever, yoga, church, wherever the hell, and try to shift white ladies so that they will stop voting for Donald Trump. That's all we need you to do. Just shift them. If y'all will just do that, we can handle the rest. We literally can, right? Just do that. So what I'm saying is that call-out culture doesn't constitute radical politics all by itself. Black feminism is not a project that emerges as a mere intervention into the machinations of white supremacy. Black feminism is an affirmative project. It is a project of Black world making, particularly of Black women's world making. It is the place where we get to be the stars of the story and to imagine what it would look like to build a world in which all Black people could live and thrive, unencumbered by white supremacy, patriarchy, or capitalism. It's hard to be about the work of building and constructing if all your time is spent raging at everybody who has treated you wrong. And I want to say that they probably did do you wrong, but you got to figure out how you're going to use your energy. So part of what it means to have eloquent rage is, as a superpower, is a willingness to know when and where to wield it. I fundamentally believe that those who do the work of making institutions more inclusive, more equitable, and more just are the people who belong to the future. We are the ones who stand in the gap between, for instance, administrators who would stop the flow and thrust of history and time, and students who are here ready to make their impact. Now is the time to head unapologetically toward the very Black, very brown, very queer, and very femme future that we all want. Thank you. Okay, yep, let's do it.
Hi.
Hi.
What piece of advice would you give a young, up-and-coming, about-to-be unprofessional Black woman today? Like, if you could go back in time and the single-handedly best piece of advice you wish you had gotten, what would you be? Besides the talk.
Chill out. Well, you know, they always do those. You know, what would you say to your younger self? Chill out. I was so uptight. Oh my God. You know, because that's the thing. You're an overachiever. You're like, I'm out here. I'm got to change the world. You know, I got to represent for my family. You know, I'm trying to be great. And all of this. And then you're just sort of anxious and depressed and not integrated. And so just chill out. Trust yourself. Trust your training. Trust that you're going to be all right. And, you know, treat people well, because, you know, put the energy out into the world that you want to have back. I'm not here for folks who sort of, I'm here for ambition and confidence, not here for climbing, because it typically means you step on people. So don't step on folks, just build your thing, right? Yeah. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Your words are honestly so empowering, and honestly felt like there's grace that feels so understood. So I think at UVA in particular, there's sort of this situation where when students of color go to their safe spaces, which may be like a people of color house, a fraternity house, a sorority house, it's viewed as self-segregation. And I'd like to hear your perspective on what self-segregation may mean and how we should address that.
Oh yeah, I don't think that means anything. I think it means that I mean, you know, you can read Beverly Daniel Tatum's great book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? It's the classic work about this. But, you know, segregation is the wrong word. Segregation is entirely a product of white supremacy. And segregation is not about what happens when a group of black kids get together and just want to enjoy each other's company. Segregation is about the ways that our public schools, for instance, are funded in such a way that, you know, black kids and brown kids in them can't get a good education, and then it makes it even harder for them to get into prestigious institutions like this one. And that's the thing we should say, is that when people use language, you don't have to concede the terms of their language. What you can do if you're going to discuss things with people is just say to them, do you actually know what the history of segregation is? Because segregation ain't never something that black people did to themselves. It's always a thing that white people did to us, right? The other thing is that I think that white people become uncomfortable with the idea that our sole goal in life is not to try to be close to them or approximate to them, right? Because essentially what happens, right, is that black people are saying, not we want to be all next to y'all, it's that all the good, y'all have all the good things. You get the good restaurants, the police protect y'all rather than kill you. You literally, like, y'all think about, you know, I live near New York, and so, you know, have lots of friends in Brooklyn, and what they're talking about is like what happens when gentrification comes. Dope restaurants, you can go to the artisanal cheese shop or whatever, you know, the schools get better, and all of that happens proximate to white people. So that there's a way that just bringing a white body into the space increases property values, increases, you know, market share, all of these sorts of things. And so black folks are saying, we want access to resources, not access to white people. And here's what that means. The other thing is recognizing that black people ain't never been the people who said, we dismiss all of y'all out of hand, right? White people created systems, their ancestors, not you white. Their ancestors, though. Right? Created systems of race that classified people into groups. And so now it becomes easy to then cast that history on black folk and brown folk who are really trying to figure out how to protect themselves and be well. And so I would just tell you that some of this is don't get into certain kinds of debates. Right? The issue is the debate. You don't have to justify where you want to go with your time. When, you know, because when white people walk into a room and they're just there by themselves, they don't think we're self-segregating. But they want us to think when we're together, that I'm like, I'm with my people. These are people who raised me. My whole life looks this way. What are you talking about? Right? And so stop feeling like other people's questions of you become a moment when you have to go on the defensive. See, then when people do that to me, then I start asking them questions. Oh, well, why does it bother you? Well, what do you think is happening? Well, do you think we're missing something if you're not there? Get people to start thinking about what position they're taking rather than you justifying what you're doing. This is always the goal. Rather than you know, when people start putting you on the defensive, and women have to learn this too, because people like to put us on the defensive as a gender thing. And when they do that, you just take a pause. You know, you'll feel that defensiveness. Pause. And then figure out what's going on here, and then shift. And rather than giving answers, start asking questions. Start asking questions. I'm saying that you literally have to have a tactical approach, right, to dealing with this. And it'll help you. And then you'll realize that they'll leave you alone after 2 questions, because they ain't got an answer. Okay, yes and yes.
So I'm Danielle, Dr. Cooper. I wanted to thank you endlessly for coming and speaking with us.
Yes.
And my question is, how do you advise for people in this room and myself as a queer person of color in maneuvering through the potential paradoxical situation of engaging with these predominantly white institutions that champion our disempowerment without institutionalizing our rights?
Yeah, so you're saying, how do you be in the university but not become of the university in a certain sort of way? Look, I think that the benefit of being a person of color, and I would say, you know, look, I won't speak to queer experience, but I will say that what queer folk have taught me, and what being a black person has taught me, is that we code switch and exist in multiple places simultaneously very well. It's a way of life. And I think that the way that you resist institutionalization is that you don't concede that the most valuable things that will happen in your life will happen in the space of the university. So you don't have to concede that you come here as a blank slate with nothing good. This is really the reason I became a black feminist. You know, even though that happened in the university, I became a black feminist because I had black women professors who said, all the parts of you matter here in our project. The stuff your grandmother taught you, it matters for how you think about the world. It is a kind of epistemology. So they helped me to see that the people who raised me and shaped me had something fundamental to do with how I would move in the world, and that the goal of my being there wasn't to learn to theorize like white boys, right? It wasn't to learn to theorize like Kant and Foucault and all those guys. It was to learn what those dudes' arguments were, but not to become them, but rather to become myself. And so I feel like finding the politics that allow you to become fully yourself, whatever they are, and to say that all the pieces of you matter are the way that you don't buy into the institutional project. You have to see, you know, I mean, look, I think we should see ourselves as institutional interlopers, places, people that are in these places that were not conceived for us, who are here to get things from them that we can then take to engage in the freedom projects that we're engaged in. And you have to sort of remind yourself about that. And I would also say don't be so hard on yourselves in the moments where you forget. Because it is really hard to be in these places with really high expectations of you being one thing, you wanting to be another. And sometimes you forget, and it shows up as, I'm not good enough, or I can't translate well, or why can't I do this particular thing? And that's when you need crew. And then you call them up and you be like, now tell me that I'm great, because these people have made me feel terrible. Or, you know, for me, that's when I call my mom, right? Because she's like, no, baby, you've always been smart. Like, right? But everyone needs those people too. That's why you need people, because they can see the thing that the institution is trying to take out of you. Graduate training, I experienced to be particularly violent. It's like you go through it, and you come out talking a different way. You know, you do. You know, the ways in which... Stop saying that! How? The word is how. That's the word you had before you got there, is how, right? The ways in which, you know, the sorts of, you know, all of these weird text things are always already, you know, y'all know all the things. So you come in, you're like, you know, you're trying to do all that. So I would just say, and look, here's the thing. What I like, though, at this stage of my career, is that I can do that, too. And sometimes I'll do it just because I feel like my white colleagues forget that I can. So then I'll be like, okay, this is what we doing today? Cool, that's fine. I can flow like that, too. I prefer not to. It's a lot of work for me. I don't want to, but it's necessary. Right? And so I say to like, folk of color, it's all tools in your arsenal. It's all tools in your arsenal. And so try to have a clear sense of yourself. So that means, too, to form relationships apart from the institution, so that you can remember who you are. Yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes.
I had a trans friend of color who used to get paid to recruit other people into STEM and STEAM. And then she stopped doing it because she realized she was putting them in places of like unsafe places, and they never listened to like fire the people who were making things so unsafe.
Sure.
And all that. So she decided to do something else. And I remember what you were saying about building something.
Yeah.
Sometimes you need to destroy stuff so you have some space to build some stuff.
Sure.
And just so, what's acceptable, eloquent, graceful way to destroy some shit?
Yeah. You know, I don't know. I mean, I feel like that, see, I think that that's the easiest conversation, is that and this is the thing I struggle with, and I'll just admit to this. Part of the reason I'm not always here for the conversation about destruction is not because I don't think some things need to die. It's because as a person who has experienced a lot of violence, I think that people get very caught up in metaphors of violence and destruction and think that that is revolutionary. And that feels deeply masculinist to me. The project of revolutionary violence and destroy so that we can rebuild feels really masculine. And what feels more true to my experience is the black women who raised me, I don't think any of them would say, having had men destroy their lives repeatedly and having to rebuild, that rubble is the best space from which to rebuild. And that is the debate I want us to have. What is the best set of conditions from which to rebuild? Should we clear this whole thing out? Which I think feels good and feels cathartic. Or should we build a new over top of, underneath, through, out of, right? Because then it's different. It's like the moment that you bring a black person in, or a trans person in, or a queer person in, it is different. Now, how different remains to be seen. But there is a way that difference can happen without destruction, I think. And I get that doesn't always feel revolutionary because it sounds like I'm saying just reform the existing structures, but I'm not. I'm saying transform. Right? I'm not saying make this thing function better. I'm saying we get the limitations of the thing, right? But I am also saying that I am tired of a revolutionary project that says that what you do is hand to people who have always had things taken, a pile of rubble, and then say, now build something new again. Don't we deserve more than that, right? It's this way that we talk about resilience. Oh, such and such is resilient. Black children are resilient. Black people are resilient. Which really is this perverse way of saying, let's see how much shit we can refuse to give you and you still live. That's what we mean when we say resilience. Okay, well, we took away some more resources and they still living. Man, they resilient. And I'm like, yeah, right. You know, black women and black people, we are masters at building something out of nothing. I mean, that's hip hop. Take away our instruments, we'll become the instruments. Why hip hop instruments, right? But it's like, but if we can do all that with nothing, imagine if you gave us something, and that something wasn't rubble. So that's it. So I think it's a debate. I don't think I know the answer to that, because I don't disagree with you. I'm just telling you that my orientation is not destroy and then tell me to build. My orientation is, let me find somewhere where there's a beginning, and let me figure out if we can create a new beginning. Because I don't want us to keep having to be traumatized to get to a revolution. And I feel like that's the debate that I want to have with revolutionary. Because sometimes the folks who romanticize violence, I'll be like, y'all ain't really seen no violence. That feels clear to me, because when you seen it, you ain't trying to do that shit ever again. Yeah. Yes, it is.
Hey, Brittney, my name is Alexa. Thank you for coming to rock with us. I'm a second year grad student in the politics department, and you mentioned something along the lines of Black feminism is not a reactionary project, right? The work that I do in my department constantly wants to center Black feminism, right, as not a reactionary project. So what do you say, like, to a Black woman in grad school trying to do this work? What do you say to what advice would you give her for her response to constantly say, no, this should be the center. No, it's not reactionary. No, this does matter. No, this should be a part of the canon. What is your response to people who constantly tell you that it is a reactionary project?
You're in grad school, pull out receipts.
Yeah.
I mean, you're here to figure out how to fight better. And so, look, hopefully my book Beyond Respectability will be useful to you in that project. It's one of the reasons that I wrote it, because everyone always thinks that white men were the first to say something, right? That they were the first to have an original thought about how you might organize the world. And so my scholarly work is very much about saying, do y'all actually know Black women's intellectual traditions and know that they don't start in 1977, even though I love Combahee, even though I love Barbara Smith, right? They don't start, Black feminism doesn't start in that moment, right? You look at Mariah Stewart, right? The kinds of arguments, so I say, look at the traditions and then go through and show the way that Black women's ideas come forth. Another person I tell every Black feminist I know to read is Professor Christy Dotson. She's a philosopher at Michigan State. She's one of the dopest Black feminist thinkers of our generation. She is a person that I have seen roll into a room of white male philosophers and take them all down. It was truly one of my greatest strengths. Because she is thinking about the epistemological structures that shape. So part of what I'm saying to you is that it does actually, in the classroom, come with your guns, right? It needs to be a scholarly debate, and you need to have the confidence that you can win. I think the strategy has to be deciding what days you want to fight. In grad school, I would do both things, and I was, sometimes it would just be me against whole classrooms. It actually was. And I would be like, y'all wrong, no, and I'm right though, and I'm about to show you. And I don't know that it changed them, but it just let them know, do not fuck with me, which I think you have to have some of that, right? But sometimes I would just be like, you know what, not today though. I don't actually feel like it today. And I think that those are reasonable stances. I think you have to find allies, so figure out who can be on your committee around here, who can snatch a coattail, have some power to advocate for you. And the real thing I would say, because I know people are like, how does she go around and just talk crazy to white people? Like, how is she able to do it? Like, how? Because I'm tired. And because go look at my CV though, right? So I don't just talk crazy to white people for fun. Like, I actually have work, and that work is not about white people. It's actually about the intellectual traditions of black women and the things that they say. So when people want to do this kind of work, I tell them, but I actually do my work though. I read a lot. Any set of positions I'm going to take, there's a citations list to back it up. And so you will win. You can win these arguments. You just have to decide that you're going to be the tightest in the room and that they can't fade you. And here's the thing, and that will also make some white people mad, because they get mad about that. But it's fine. Create you a system of support, figure out how to war, and look, and I had black professors who said to me in grad school, like, some things don't go to war with your committee about, like, figure out the wars you can win, and the wars is not worth fighting, and then, and if you don't always know, then find you some mentors that you can call and say, I don't actually know how to deal with this. And just know that there will be a narrative anyway. But if your seminar papers are tight, and your articles are tight, and your citations lists are great, and you're using the scholars to make the arguments that you need to make, then there's only so much that they can do to you. And so I would, look, this is not a battle. It is a battle. And I think it's one worth fighting, and I hope that we're putting out the kind of scholarship that makes those battles easier. Yeah. Yes?
I think you may have answered this question, or this different question, but
Yeah.
I wanted to know, what do you do when you're on the defense and you're trying to be an ally, but they go back to the whole religious aspect? How do you, I feel like it's a roadblock from making progress.
What do you mean religious?
Like you're talking to somebody and it's not that you're being defensive or trying to change views, but you're just trying to have a conversation with anybody, but they go back to, this is my belief system, this is how I believe, this is what I believe.
Yes.
How do you handle that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you can say, look, like, you have the right to your belief system, but if that's the belief system you're going to claim, then you just have to be accountable for the harms that it does. Right? And, and also, remind folks that, we're in a university, and that that having a belief system doesn't mean that you get to be unquestioned, and that surely what they're not saying is that the God they believe in or the belief they profess, that they're using it so that they can be less smart about critical questions. Like, you might want to take a jab. You know what I mean? But like, surely you're not using God because you don't know the answer to the question. Right? And then just walk away, because clearly they're not ready to have a conversation. You know what I mean? Just hold people accountable for the things that they claim. If that's the set you're claiming, cool. Right? You know what I mean? It's all good. Just know that it is associated with these particular things, and I'm going to associate you with those things until you give me a different reason to do that. And then I'm going to deal with you accordingly. Right? Yep. Yes.
So, obviously I'm white, but then I'm also like a gay Latina. So for people like me who exist in like a weird space, I wondered if you had words of advice for like using your privilege to call people out without putting like the parts of your identity that are more marginalized at risk.
I don't know, sis. I mean, look, sometimes I feel like, people feel like there's always an answer, and I think part of your journey is figuring out how to hold all those competing parts. And recognizing that you learn over time how to do it, right? Like, I feel like I have lots of contradictory sort of things, right? I'm a professor, come from working class people, I'm deeply Southern, I'm a Christian, I go to church, I cuss like a sailor, I am ratchet, I am, lots of competing things. I consider myself a, radical black feminist, and in 2016 people were like, how dare you support Hillary Clinton? I was like, because I don't want our people to die under Trump. And so I think the thing that you learn is just, these are all the parts of me. And you learn that certain parts of you become more salient in particular moments. And then you become okay with it. Rather than seeing these things in conflict, they just all become parts of you that you get to embrace. Well, I'm a white-skinned Latina, so that means that that in some moments I'm gonna have to call out people when they don't know who the fuck I am, right? And then you do that, right? And you be like, I'm just over here stealthing people because they don't even see me coming. And here I go, right? And you reframe it as your superpower, you know what I mean? That's the whole point. That the stuff that people would weaponize against you can only be used as a weapon against you if you refuse to see the power in it that you can wield for good. Anger gets used against black women as a thing to discredit us, as a thing to say that we're unintelligent, that we're not rational, that we're not able to be part of the conversation. And that was part of the reason I wrote Eloquent Rage, to say, look, yeah, I'm mad as hell because these systems are designed to kill us and we can't survive in that way. But what I can do is I can either let you weaponize my anger against me in my classroom, or I can use it as the thing that powers what I do and makes me better. And so you can allow folks to weaponize this, or you can say, you know what, precisely because I have access to some spaces that my brown family members and comrades don't, there's some particular work that I'm called to do in the world, and I'm going to commit to doing that work. But I'm also very clear about who I am and where my political commitments lie. And so I am legitimately able to also be in that space. And then don't apologize for that. When you are all right with all the pieces, everybody around you will be all right with all the pieces too. Yeah. Or they'll get the hell out of it. Yeah. Okay. I see these two right here, so I'm gonna get them. Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So first of all, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
You're great. So second, in your book you say that feminism is inherently queer punk.
Yes.
It's all about loving women.
Yes.
Apologetically and all that.
Yes.
So I feel like within the past year I've been like in a transition with my own feminism, like not being really comfortable calling myself a feminist yet, but as I've done readings, like that's a common thing with black women and other women of color, that just uncomfortability with the calling themselves feminists, right?
Yeah.
So, given the fact that you wrote that it's about loving all women,
Yeah.
what would you say to black women and women of color that can't really come to terms with that when you have white women, very people that don't love you at the same time?
That's a good question. Look, I didn't say that you should like all women. What I said was that, and what I'm speaking to is not getting in bed with folks who treat you crazy and mistreat you. I'm saying that, so in the book I talk about, I use an early moment where Beyonce is grappling with being a feminist, and she says, well, I'm a feminist in a way because I love my girls. Those relationships are the most important relationships to me. And so what I'm talking about is the way that we live in a world where I watch women who say this thing about, I don't trust other women. I really am, cooler with dudes. Dudes are so much better. Women are kind of catty. I don't really, so the working class community is supposed to be like, I don't trust females, which makes me want to fight everybody, right? But it's women who say this. And then I was also trying to speak to this other thing where you have women who claim feminism, but treat other women like trash. Don't actually have an ethic of interpersonally loving and being loving towards women. And so I'm calling out the way that our politics are incongruent. We say we espouse a whole host of things, but then you don't actually love women well. That's also calling out black men who say we love black people, but you don't love black women, so then you don't love all black people, right? Or you know, black men who say, oh, I'm a feminist, but then I look at how you treat ladies in your life, and I be like, but how though? Because you can poke this bell hooks, but you left a trail of, you know, aching women in your wake, right? That's the kind of love that I mean. I'm not talking about a like kumbaya. I love all women. As I say in Eloquent Rage, I don't have no white friends. Not like that, not really. I think I have 2 now. Okay. So, I mean, look, legit, like, as a person who grew up with nothing but white friends, I learned my lesson, and now, I did. I mean, most of my friends were white. You know, I tell the story. Most of my friends were white because I was like in gifted and talented classes in a segregated state where I went to class with white people, and I got bullied by black kids, and I didn't really have substantial black friends until I went to a black college. And so I grew up mostly having white friends, and now that's just not my life. And so that ain't the kind of feminism I'm talking about. I am saying that when you say you are committed to this project, that it means that you love women as people. And I am also saying that to politically love women, which is a thing I think black feminists get. See, white feminists often, their freedom project is about equality with white men, very often. This is why black feminists take such issue with liberal white feminism. It's why women of color struggle to claim feminism, because they think that it's all about trying to be like white girls, and white girls are often trying to be like their husbands and brothers and fathers. They've lived in close proximity to them. They see how white men run the world, and they want the power to be able to do that. But historically, when you think about the way white men have run the world, it's all about suppressing other people. And so if that's the end goal of your feminism, I don't want any part of that. Black feminism says we eat, everybody eats, right? We want every kid to be able to go to school. We want people to be safe in their neighborhoods. We want people to be able to live and thrive. We want people to be able to love whoever they love, right? So we have an ethic that is about justice. That is what a black feminist project is about. It says, look, all of these structuring systems, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, and all the things that derive from them, choke our ability to be full human beings. And we want to dismantle those systems. And when you look at the earliest versions of black feminism, they're very clear about how you have to tackle all the systems, right? And so here's what that then means. That don't mean you have to be friends with white women. It means you know that your freedom project gets them free too. Because what you know is that they are much farther from freedom than they think. And the thing that white women learned in 2016, right, is that you can't get in bed with white supremacy without getting in bed with patriarchy. Right? And that's what they did. They got in bed with white supremacy because they thought it would keep them from patriarchy, and it didn't work. And so then we watched Christine Blasey Ford be the cautionary tale about what happens when you think that powerful white men with their power unchecked actually have anyone's interest at heart. That's what a feminist of color approach teaches you. That's why it matters. And so I'm not telling you to go out here and hug a bunch of ladies that you don't like. I'm telling you that sometimes what it means to love people is recognizing when you have more vision than they do, and you don't have to impose that vision, but you have to ethically live it out your own self. And so that's what I'm trying to do, and that's why I reject white feminism. That's the thing. I'm a feminist, but I don't think white women invented feminism. They didn't. They were observing indigenous women. At Seneca Falls, they were observing indigenous women who could vote, who could participate, who could own property, and they were like, we want to be able to do that shit, right? And it's black women who have always said, like, our gender matters too, and we're not going to let nobody leave us behind. And so when you don't think they invented it, then you don't have no conflict about getting on board with the project, because it's not their project, it's our project that they came late to, and which we will happily have them at because they have privilege that will be useful for our revolution. That's the only way this works.
Thank you for coming. And Dr. Avery's class, we talked a lot about surveillance and policing and respectability politics, especially in institutions like this.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite quotes from your book was when you said, "What I learned from watching white kids who were set up to succeed while black kids were set up to fail, even in matters of intimacy, was that sexual self-regulation was critical to my success." And any regulation of any kind, but especially sexual self-regulation, that really struck me. And I guess my question is, when an institution like UVA, when you can't separate UVA and surveillance, how do you try to dismantle that surveillance without being the labor completely of Professor Avery or Dr. Avery?
I don't know that I fully get the contours of it, but I would say, how do you dismantle? I think you got to figure out what your goal here is in the university. I will say to you that I think that we ask students to do too much labor because it's unpaid free labor too. It is. I mean, we ask students to do a lot of our diversity labor for us, right? We ask students to do a lot of the labor of making institutions more just. The challenge of that is that movements come from students. So administrators can't get their marching orders to change things unless students rise up and say, hey, we don't want things to be this way. So I would say to you that you have to know that you actually do have power in the institution to change it. Then when there are mass movements on campuses, in an earlier version of this talk, I talked about the kids who took down the president at Mizzou in 2015 because they were like, oh, we just won't play and we'll just cost you money. And then he was gone, like in a day, right? Like we had one kid who was striking and was gonna like on a hunger strike, and that didn't get him, but money got, so good organizing can change things. I would say that, and I hope that what we're engaged in here is an ideas revolution. So I think that your goal here has to be to figure out the ideas that you think will change things, and then try to figure out how you're going to live out those ideas, and how you're going to live them out in activist communities, and how you're going to live it out in your work. That's one of the best things I think you can do. I'm not saying that you shouldn't transform the institution and fight when you see clear injustices, but I'm saying that you have to have a balance between organizing against the injustice that you see, and also remembering that you're here to get a thing, a set of resources, tools, concepts, so that you can go do the work you're supposed to do in the world. And I didn't balance those things well in college, and I left college burnt out and irritated. Because I was like, I'm trying to make things better for students who will come after me. Yes. Thankfully, I got the things I came there for, but I felt really resentful of the institution. So try to have a healthy relationship to it. And I don't totally get the part about surveillance and the ways that that is showing up. But I would say, some of that might just require a little bit of creativity around what does it mean to not, I do think that we can be smarter about the ways that we give people access to all the parts of us. I don't think we have to, so I think that is thinking about your relationship to social media, thinking about whether every single thing you want to do needs to be public, and what does it mean to sort of go analog sometimes and get folks in rooms and spaces and say, let's not actually tweet about what happened. Let's actually not, make snaps about it. Let's just be here with each other and see what cool things come. That very fleshy material connection is one of the only ways that we can subvert the sort of digital project of surveillance. Never think that institutions have total power and control over you. They never, ever do. Even when it seems like they do, there's always creative forms of resistance. That doesn't mean you can topple the structure all the time, but I'm saying one of my key things of my life and of this work and of this talk is you don't ever have to concede the terms that people are putting forth for you. So you don't have to concede that that just because you are endlessly surveilled, that there is nothing that you get to keep for yourself. Yeah. All right, y'all.